Now, our first game in this video is Magnus Carlsen versus Ding Liren from the 2020 Carlsen Tour Finals, and this game was epic. In the game, Magnus opens 1e4 best by test. Then Ding Liren responds 1c5, the Sicilian defense, then knight f3, d6, and d4, the open Sicilian. Black takes on d4, white takes back. Then finally, knight f6, knight c3, a6. This is the Najdorf with the key move a6. Black's idea is to control the b5 square, then follow up with e5 a move later. And here, of course, white has a wide variety of moves available, but in the game, he goes for the English attack, starting with the move 6, bishop to e3. Now, in the game, Ding Liren goes for the most popular option on move 6 for black. That is simply 6e5, breaking in the center immediately and challenging that knight on the d4 square. Now here, white has two main options. One is knight to f3. This move is playable, but it's not really the English attack move. Instead, Magnus goes for the more thematic idea, knight to b3. And from here, the idea, again, is very, very simple. White wants to go f3, queen d2 at long castles. And then after that, start an attack on the king side with the move g4 and g5. And white might even play g4 and g5 earlier before his castle, depending on what black does here. Now from here, Ding Liren plays the standard move in the Najdorf, that is bishop to e6. This move is a very flexible idea. From here, black can go bishop e7 and short castle, or he can go knight to d7, perhaps rook to c8, and b5, getting counterplay on the queen side right away before castling. So both ideas from black are very playable. Now here in the game, Magnus goes queen d2. This move is a little bit strange. Typically, white is going to go f3 first before queen d2, but queen d2 first, very playable. And now here, Ding Liren continues with the move bishop to e7. This move and knight to d7 are roughly equally popular and real fast here. It's important to know black cannot punish for white for going queen d2 before f3. For example, if he goes knight g4, then white simply responds bishop g5, then the best move from black is knight to f6. And surprisingly here, the move f4 for white is actually very good, and he's fighting for a very large edge. So knight g4, not a good idea from white. Instead here, Ding Liren just continues developing the king side with the move bishop to e7. Now here in the game, Magnus goes f3, the standard idea, again getting ready for g4, expanding on the king side. And here, black has to make a big choice. Do you castle on the king side, or do you start counterplay somewhere? Now here, Ding Liren once again has a very big choice. In the game, he goes for the most popular idea and the modern move. That is simply h5, gaining space on the king side and immediately stopping g4 ideas from white. So for example, if white went for the standard English attack move here, g4, then black just takes on g4, then recaptures with the knight, and here black has a massive advantage. So, of course, Magnus does not go g4 in this position. Now, it's important to note this move h5 does have some drawbacks. Of course, the big drawback of this move h5 from black is that it does weaken the king side in general, and now the king pretty much has to stay on the e8 square for a while. Meanwhile, white can simply castle on the king side or on the queen side, depending on what he wants to do. So, black losing a lot of flexibility in return for stopping that g4 idea from white temporarily. Now, from here, the standard idea for white is simply long castles. However, in this game, Magnus Carlsen throws a little bit of a curveball. He goes bishop e2 first. This is Magnus just trying to throw his opponent off guard a little bit. Now here, Ding Liren goes knight to d7, the standard idea. Again, castles kingside when you play h5 is not recommended this early in the game. Now here, Ding Liren, knight d7, and here, Magnus Carlsen jumps forward with the knight. Knight to d5 is the move. This is definitely the strongest idea in the position, and this is a very thematic idea in the Najdorf, but especially when black plays the move h5. Now here, white's threat is really simple. It's simply knight takes e7. If black wastes a move, then knight takes e7 is the move. So here, black takes the knight on the d5 square with the bishop. Bishop takes d5 on the board. Of course, instead, knight takes d5, also perfectly playable. It's a very popular line for black. The main line goes e takes, then bishop to f5. And from here, white can castle on the queen side or the king side, follow up with expanding on the queen side, perhaps bishop d3 at some point, challenging the bishop, and it's a very complicated game. Now, instead of that, bishop takes d5 on the board from Ding Liren. This is the older move and potentially the stronger idea. Then Magnus takes back with the pawn. And now we have a complete transformation of the pawn structure in this game. Of course, white now has that queenside pawn majority, the 4 pawns on the queen side versus the 3 of Ding Liren. However, Ding Liren now has the kingside pawn majority, 4 on the king side versus 3 for Magnus. Now, this means we have a very double-edged game ahead of us here. Magnus is actually going to expand on the queen side with either a4 or c4, potentially trying to create a pass pawn on the queen side. Meanwhile, Ding Liren, his main plan is to go either h4 or even e4 some point, trying to gain space on the king side and getting counterplay. Now here, what is the main idea for Ding? Well, the best move is going to be queen to c7, a very flexible move. Again, you don't want to commit any of your pawns just yet. And from there, white's probably going to go long castles, maybe intending king b1 and c4, trying to gain more space on the queen side where he has that pawn majority. Now, instead of this, in the game, Ding Liren, instead of queen c7, he actually goes for the move b6. Now, this move is very logical if Magnus Carlsen went short castles. So, for example, if Magnus short castle here, then queen c7, and we have a very normal game, black's going to follow with a5, try to blockade white's advances on the queen side, and then get his own king side play going at some point with either e4 or h4. Now, of course, the drawback of the move b6 is you do prematurely commit the pawns on the queen side, and here, instead of short castles, Magnus simply castles on the queen side. And yes, long castles is the move. And now, why is b6 so bad? Well, in this structure, you actually want that pawn on the b5 square instead of b6. And that means if black ever goes b6 to b5, he essentially wasted a tempo going b5 in 2 tempos instead of 1 directly. So Magnus here essentially up an entire tempo in this game. Now Ding Liren queen c7, getting the queen onto the most flexible square, and now Magnus king b1, getting the king off that c-file, and preparing potentially rook c1 ideas and maybe even c4. And finally here, Ding Liren does expand on the queen side a second time with the move b5. This is a very important knight or style move. And of course, this move b5 does free up the b6 square for the knight. Black may go knight to b6 next, trying to put pressure on that pawn on the d5 square and potentially threatening knight to c4 ideas. So this move b5, very important from black. Now Magnus, he has a wide variety of options that he could play. One idea is rook to g1, prepping g4, or rook to e1, just try to play solid in the center. A different idea is actually c4, immediately expanding on the queen side. So for example, c4, then b takes, and finally rook to c1, and now that pawn on the c4 square is pinned to the queen. And that means Magnus is going to have enough time to regain the pawn with either the rook or the bishop on the e2 square, and white's going to have an excellent game with very good play on the queen side despite castling there. Now instead of this, Magnus goes for a third option in the game, that is jumping forward with the knight to the a5 square. This is again a very key idea in the English attack with the move e5 from black. Now, what the heck is Magnus Carlsen's idea here? Well, it's very simple. He wants to jump into that c6 square with the knight. And this idea of knight a5 to c6 is relevant whenever you go knight d5 and recapture with the e-pawn, because then that pawn does support that c6 square, allowing knight to c6 jumping in right away. Now here, Ding Liren finds the best idea, that is knight to b6, putting pressure on that pawn on the d5 square. Of course, black is threatening knight takes d5 next, because then white could not recapture with the queen. That would be suicide, losing the queen. Okay, here, what is Magnus supposed to do? Well, he has two good ideas. One is simply chopping off that knight on the b6 square. That does remedy the threat of knight takes d5. And the other is to break with move c4 right away. Now c4 looks kind of strange, but it turns out it's very strong in this position. Now in the game, Magnus went for the first option, bishop takes b6. Now this is a very committal move. You do not want to give up that dark square bishop for white without a very good reason. So here, Magnus Carlsen, he takes on b6, black takes back, and then Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the knight to the c6 square, putting pressure on that bishop on e7. So although white lost the dark square bishop, overall his position is very dominant so far. Now from here, black goes bishop d8, a very curious looking move, trying to keep the bishop alive. If white does take it, then black recaptures with the rook on the a8 square, and he maintains the option of castling kingside later in the game instead of having to go king to e7 if that bishop stayed on the e7 square instead. Now here, Magnus expands on the queen side with the move c4. We talked about this move so far quite a bit, and if that c-file opens up, believe it or not, it's going to be very good for Magnus, as he simply has to go rook to c1, and he will dominate that file. Now here, Ding Liren, he's already in quite a bit of trouble. What should he do in this game? Well, he has a few different options. One is simply castling and ignoring the threat of c takes b5. The other is taking on c4, and finally, he can go b4, trying to sacrifice a pawn. Let's go through those ideas one by one. Here at black castle, then white has the very simple idea of taking on b5, then going queen to b4, putting pressure on that pawn on the b5 square. And here, yes, black does have that open a-file for the rook, but Magnus Carlsen at any point could go a3, trying to defend, and overall, he's a tremendous game. Here, white can play on the queen side, and then later on the king side with perhaps rook g1, prepping g4 ideas. So again, this is a very common idea in this e5 line. White here, believe it or not, can play on both sides of the board with a lot of success. Now, instead of short castles, black could also play the move b4, try to lock down the queen side. However, here Magnus can simply take the pawn with the knight. Knight takes b4 is the move, and here black really doesn't have sufficient compensation for that pawn. Now in the game, Ding Liren played potentially the strongest idea. That is simply b takes c4, opening up the b file for the attack on the white king. However, this does give white the c file, and that is going to be very good for white in this game. Now here, Magnus Carlsen simply takes on c4, and once again, Ding Liren has that question, what the heck do you do with that king? Well, in the game, it castles short, finally. However, this does have the drawback. Now that pawn on the h5 square is a little bit weaker. If white ever gets g4 in, then black's king side is going to be incredibly weak. Now here, Magnus, once again, what are his ideas? Well, there are a few good ones that I found. One is simply rook g1 intending g4. The other is rook h to e1 as Magnus played in the game, simply centralizing the rooks and preparing maybe the idea of f4 breaking in the center. And finally, a last idea is expanding on the queen side with the move a4. The idea is to threaten a5, try to lock down the queen side. Of course, that knight on the b5 square does support that a5 square, meaning that pawn wedge on e5 could be very stable for a very long time for white. Now in the game, white goes rook h to e1, again centralizing all of his major pieces and potentially threatening f4 next, at which point white would be very well suited for an opening of the center. Now here, Ding Liren, he senses trouble and he plays the best move. That is simply knight to d7. The idea behind this is if white ever goes g4 and then threatening g5, that knight will be out of the way of the attack. He can potentially go knight to c5 at some point, activating the knight further. And beyond that, this bishop on d8 now has access to this entire diagonal here, and a bishop h4 resource may come in handy. Now here, instead of f4, Magnus actually breaks on the king side with the move g4. Of course, with the knight no longer on the f6 square controlling g4, this idea of g4 is very, very strong. Now, g4 on the board, black takes with the h-pawn, white takes back. And here, Ding Liren plays the creative idea, bishop to h4. This move is very essential. First of all, it does, of course, attack the rook on the e1 square. However, beyond that, it does a great job of trying to keep this h-file closed for now. For example, if black did not go bishop h4, then white could threaten to move h4 at some point. And yes, even though the bishop does cover the h4 square, white could then go rook to h1, activating the rook on the newly opened h-file, and black would be in a lot of trouble there. So bishop h4, by far the best move for black in this position. Now here you may be wondering, where is Magnus Carlsen going to move the rook? And the answer, believe it or not, is he does not. Instead, he actually sacrifices the rook with the move g5, immediately going for the attack. Now this move g5 from Magnus was not 100% necessary. Instead, there are plenty of other good rook moves. Rook to f1 is playable. Even rook to e3 intending rook to h3 is playable. However, this move g5 by Magnus Carlsen is also very, very strong. His idea is he's threatening g6, and that pawn is going to be a battering ram on the king side. Of course, this move does give up the rook if black wants it. So can black take the rook in this game? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to assess, is bishop takes e1 a good move or a suicidal move for black? Well, it turns out bishop takes e1 is a critical mistake. Here, black takes the rook. Then white has the incredible shot, knight to e7 check. The idea is you force king to h8, and then you simply take back with the queen. You're threatening queen to h4, checking the king, and here white has a tremendous amount of threats. I mean, if you can believe it, the computer even says white has a forced mate in 8 moves here. So bishop takes e1, not a good idea at all from black. All right, what are black's options? One option is simply g6, try to blockade that pawn on the g6 square. And the other option is to expand on the king side with move f5. Now, let's investigate f5 real fast. This move looks kind of crazy, but f5 is a very typical resource in the e5 English attack from black's perspective. The idea behind this kind of move is if white ever takes on basalt, black can recapture with the knight or the rook, and black here can make good use of this open f-file on the king side, sort of like how white is using the open c-file on the queen side despite being castled there. So now after f5, white's best move is g6, try to blockade the king side, but then black can go rook a to e8, intending rook to f6 next, trying to win that pawn on the g6 square. So f5, very, very playable, and it might be the best move here. Instead, Ding Liren does go g6, try to blockade that pawn on the g5 square. Now from here, Magnus goes rook to f1, try to stop f5 ideas from black. Black goes king g7, try to get the king a little bit more to safety and opening up that aj square for the rook. Now Magnus, queen g2. The idea, of course, the queen now has access to the h3 square, putting pressure on that bishop and potentially trying to take advantage of that open h-file. Now here black, rook to h8. Queen g4 from Magnus, threatening that knight on the d7 square and the bishop in some lines. And here already, black has a big decision to make. What do you do about this knight on d7? Do you move it? Do you defend it? How do you defend it? Well, black's best options here are going to be queen to c7, defending the knight with the queen, or f5. Now, black goes f5 here. White has an unbelievable resource. Of course, black's king is very, very vulnerable. The queen is very active here. So white here can actually play the sacrifice rook takes f5. This is a brilliant move. The idea is after black takes with the pawn, then white recaptures with the queen. Here, believe it or not, white's attack is so strong, it actually justifies sacrificing the entire rook. Now, you can investigate this line on your own. In the game, Ding Liren did go for the move queen to c7 instead of f5, so queen c7 on the board from Ding. And now, believe it or not, the best move for Magnus is once again sacrificing the rook, this time on the f7 square. So here's how the line goes. Rook takes f7, the king is forced to take. Then you jump in with the queen, queen to e6, forcing king g7. And then the move is knight to e7, threatening the g6 square with the knight and the queen. And here black is just completely overloaded. His king is in deep trouble. Now, instead of this move, rook takes f7, in the game, Magnus Carlsen went for the move rook to f3. This turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. His idea, of course, is to go rook to h3, trying to trap that bishop. However, real fast, the better idea would have been rook to d3, intending rook h3 with the other rook. Because here, obviously, this rook on the f1 square is very, very active, threatening the f7 pawn. However, the rook on the d1 square not doing nearly as much, currently cut off by that pawn on the d5 square. So for Magnus, activating the rook on d3, intending rook h3 would have been simply a better version of the plan he pursued in the game. Now, rook f3 on the board. And here, Ding Liren makes a very big mistake. He plays the move f5. Now, this idea of f5 in the Najdorf is very thematic. However, here was not the best time to do it. Here, white takes on the f6 square. Black takes back with the knight, threatening the queen on g4. And here, Magnus just simply moves back his queen to the g2 square, queen g2. Now here, look at this. All of these files are opening up on the king side. Black's king is just in a lot of trouble here. What is he going to do? Well, in the game, queen d7, trying to bring the queen over to the defense up the king's side. Not a bad idea. But here, Magnus, rook g1, threatening queen takes g6 next, and black has to respond. All right, rook h6, defending the pawn. And here, Magnus has an incredible attacking position, all of his pieces on wonderful squares. And here, Magnus, to be honest, he doesn't really need to press the issue immediately. In the game, he goes a3, just offering a little bit of loft for the king. The king can now go to the a2 square, literally whenever it wants, getting off the back rank. And from here, Magnus just slow plays the position a little bit. He goes rook b3, getting the rook on the open b file, then queen c2, and finally the move king to a2, just bolstering the queen side. He's in no rush. Black has all of these long-term weaknesses, the pawn on g6 and the king on h8. So overall, he is in no rush to press the issue. Now black, queen f5, offering a trade of queens. Of course, Magnus Carlsen needs those queens on the board to continue the attack. So with that in mind, queen d2 is the move. Try to keep the queens on the board. Now Ding, queen e4, further activating the queen and threatening that bishop on the c4 square. However, Magnus, he is not amused. He goes rook to c1, just further activating himself on the queen side. It's very cool to see Magnus threatening all these things on the king side and then shifting all of his pieces over to the queen side in the English attack. That is just the strength of this opening for white. You can literally attack on either side of the board here. Now Ding, bishop g5, very good move, threatening various discovered attacks with the bishop. For example, knight takes d5, now being threatened by black, or even knight to e6. Now here, Magnus, he must do something about this bishop on the g5 square. You either have to move the queen or, better yet, threaten the bishop with the key move rook to g3. Now this move is very, very cool. I want to show you a very cool line here. The move is rook g3. Of course, if black goes, say, knight to e6 or anywhere else threatening discovered attack, you simply take the bishop on the g5 square. However, even if black defends the bishop, say rook to h5, you could actually sacrifice the rook on the g5 square for the bishop. The idea is you follow up with the move queen to b4. And take a look at this. Here, there is simply no way for black to defend the d6 pawn. Literally the only move you could do is rook d8, but of course that drops the rook on the spot. That is not a good idea. So here, no matter what black does, you simply pick up the pawn on d6, and from there you have this passed pawn on d5 that could threaten to promote on the d8 square. So in the end, here white gives up the rook on g5 in exchange for winning that d6 pawn and getting the passed pawn that could promote to a queen. So again, in the English attack, there are just so many different ideas that you can use to put pressure on your opponent. Now in the game, instead of rook g3, here Magnus goes rook c to c3. This is kind of a weird looking move. The idea is you're activating the rook on the third rank, potentially going rook to e3 next, but it really wasn't necessary, and it really doesn't address the threat of knight to e6, and this is what black does in the game. Knight to e6, threatening that queen on the d2 square with the bishop. Now, of course, here Magnus moves the queen. He goes queen to c2, offering a trade of queens, and Ding Liren does accept. Queen takes c2, and now rook takes c2. And here Magnus Carlsen did lose much of his advantage that he fought for in this game. However, now we do get to see Magnus give a masterclass in how to play this sort of English attack endgame in this opening. Here, Ding Liren jumps in with the knight. Knight d4, of course, forking those rooks. Now white takes on d4, black takes back, and then rook b6 is the move, pressuring that pawn on the d6 square as well as a6 because the bishop also attacks it right now. Now from here, bishop f4, both defending the d6 pawn and putting pressure on that pawn on the h2 square. However, white just takes the pawn on a6, black takes the rook, white takes back, and suddenly white has this queenside pawn majority, these two protected passed pawns. And Magnus Carlsen's plan is simple. He's going to march those pawns all the way down the board as fast as he possibly can. Now, Ding Liren, rook to h3, potentially threatening d3 ideas. That pawn now being defended by the rook. And a4 from Magnus, we're seeing him just start his plan. Now here, black king g7, and Magnus goes rook f2, pressuring that bishop on f4. Now bishop e3, pressuring the rook, but instead of defending, Magnus drops the bishop back to the f1 square, pressuring the rook on h3. Now, black goes bishop takes f2 here. That would be suicide, as this pawn on a4 is just too far advanced. It would promote immediately. So with that in mind, rook h5 is the move, threatening the pawn on d5. And Magnus goes rook g2, threatening the pawn on g6 and threatening bishop d3 ideas. And that's what happens in the game. Black takes that pawn on the d5 square, but Magnus here goes bishop d3, threatening g6. And now the only way to defend is rook g5, but that means the rooks come off the board. And here Magnus has a very easy plan, once again, of pushing those pawns. Now a5 is the move. Black has placed the only move to defend, bishop d8. The idea is after a6, you can go bishop b6, stopping the a7 advance. However, here Magnus just marches his king on the queen side, and in this position right here, Ding Liren resigns. There is no defense against the idea of king b6, just forcing that pawn through. Black's going to sacrifice the bishop, and then the plan is b4, b5, b6, and ultimately promoting that pawn on the b8 square. And for that reason here, Ding Liren resigns to Magnus Carlsen on the spot.